Welcome. Tonight we are exploring the hidden history of the Scots-Irish in America, from the petition signed by 319 families in 1718 to the mountain victory that turned the tide of the American Revolution in just 65 minutes. This is the story of a restless people, shaped by the edges of empires, destined to become the frontier heartbeat of a new nation. Please like, subscribe, or leave a thought below. Now, settle in, soften your shoulders, and slow your breathing. Let's begin. The year is 1600. The Anglo-Scottish border stretches for 73 miles between the Solway Firth on the western coast and the mouth of the River Tweed on the eastern coast. The terrain consists of waterlogged peat bogs, dense heather moors, and the steep, rocky slopes of the Cheviot Hills. The governments in London and Edinburgh divide this land into 6 administrative zones, called marches. 3 marches sit on the Scottish side, and 3 marches sit on the English side. Families living in these valleys swear allegiance directly to their local patriarchs. The prominent families include the Armstrongs, the Elliots, the Johnstones, the Maxwells, and the Grahams. Men from these families mount small, sure-footed ponies called hobblers. These horses navigate the muddy marshlands and steep ravines, carrying riders wearing thick wool cloaks. The riders conduct nocturnal raids to steal livestock from neighboring estates. They equip themselves with steel helmets, known as burgonets. They wear defensive jackets, constructed from small, square iron plates sewn between layers of canvas and leather. Each rider carries a wooden lance measuring 12 to 14 feet in length, tipped with a forged iron point. They ride during the long nights of the winter months to extract herds of black Galloway cattle and Cheviot sheep. A raiding party travels up to 30 miles in a single night through the freezing rain. The victims of these raids initiate a legally sanctioned pursuit called the hot trod. The pursuers carry a piece of burning peat turf fixed to the point of a long spear. They utilize specially trained bloodhounds, known locally as slough dogs. These dogs track the scent of the stolen livestock and the sweat of the horses across the damp mosses. The residents construct specialized defensive stone buildings to protect their property. These structures, called pele towers, stand 3 or 4 stories high. Builders construct the walls from local whinstone and sandstone, making them 3 to 5 feet thick. The ground floor features a vaulted stone ceiling and serves as a secure enclosure for cattle during an active raid. The entrance consists of a heavy wooden door backed by an interlocking iron grate called a yett. The residents access the upper floors through a tight, clockwise spiral stone staircase. This specific architectural design forces right-handed attackers to fight with their swords, restricted by the central stone pillar. The upper living quarters feature narrow slit windows measuring just 4 inches wide. These openings allow the defenders to fire arrows and early matchlock muskets, called calivers, at the raiders standing in the mud below. Between the raids, the border families practice a communal system of agriculture called runrig. They divide the arable land into narrow ridges, separated by deep drainage ditches. They plant crops of oats and barley in the damp, acidic soil, using wooden plows drawn by oxen. The women grind the harvested oats using flat rotary quern stones, turned by hand. They bake the resulting oat flour into flatbreads on hot iron griddles, suspended over burning peat fires. The daily diet consists of this oat bread, boiled mutton, and cheese made from the milk of their cattle. The threat of raiding dictates the construction of their secondary buildings. The families build small timber cottages, thatched with river reeds. When an opposing family approaches with torches, the residents abandon these wooden cottages and retreat behind the iron yetts of the stone Pelé towers. The raiders burn the wooden cottages and drive the cattle back across the border valleys. The English and Scottish crowns appoint local lords to serve as march wardens to police these territories. The wardens host scheduled administrative meetings, called truce days, at designated open fields along the border line. At these meetings, the wardens read lists of stolen property and demand compensation from the accused families. The compensation process involves assessing the monetary value of the stolen cattle and requiring the thieves to pay that exact amount in silver coins. The families engage in violent feuds over these payments. The Maxwells and the Johnstones fight a continuous feud for over 50 years. On December 6, 1593, the Johnstones kill Lord Maxwell and hundreds of his followers at the Battle of Dryfe Sands. The Johnstone fighters strike the Maxwell men in the face with long, heavy cavalry swords. On March 24, 1603, Queen Elizabeth I of England dies at Richmond Palace. King James VI of Scotland travels 400 miles south to London to accept the English crown. He takes the new title of King James I of England. He unites the two competing nations under a single monarch. He abolishes the border marches and renames the region the Middle Shires. He issues a royal proclamation ordering the dismantling of the iron yetts on all Pelé towers. He prohibits the border families from carrying lances, iron armor, or firearms. He commands the families to surrender their weapons to royal magistrates and focus exclusively on ploughing the fields. King James establishes a joint commission of English and Scottish judges to dismantle the armed border society. He appoints George Clifford, the 3rd Earl of Cumberland, to lead armed military expeditions into the Cheviot Hills. The royal soldiers capture hundreds of riders from the Armstrong and Graham families. The judges hold formal trials in the border cities of Carlisle and Jedburgh. They sentence over 140 border riders to death by hanging. The executioners hang the condemned men from wooden gallows erected outside the city stone walls. The crown seizes the land and the remaining cattle belonging to the executed men. In 1606, the king targets the Graham family for mass deportation. English soldiers load 150 Grahams onto wooden sailing ships. The captains transport them to the town of Flushing in the Netherlands to serve as infantry soldiers in the Dutch army. Other displaced borderers move into the surrounding lowlands to seek employment as tenant farmers, paying rent to large estate owners. The pacification leaves thousands of experienced farmers and fighters without land, cattle, or income. The region transitions from a militarized zone into a heavily regulated agricultural district overseen by royal tax collectors. Across the Irish Sea, the English crown confiscates 500,000 acres of land, following a localized rebellion in the province of Ulster. The royal administration in London prepares to populate these vacant northern territories with the landless families of the Scottish lowlands and the pacified border. The date is September 4th, 1607. A French trading ship weighing 80 tons floats in the deep water of Lough Swilly. The town of Rathmullen sits on the western shore of this saltwater inlet in County Donegal, Ireland. Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, walks onto the stone pier, and Rory O'Donnell, the Earl of Tyrconnell, walks beside him. Cuchanocht Maguire coordinates the loading of supplies onto the vessel. 90 men, women, and children board the wooden deck of the ship. The passengers wear thick wool cloaks to block the cold autumn wind blowing off the water. The crew members load wooden casks of fresh water, sealed clay jugs of ale, and bags of ground oats into the hull. O'Neill and O'Donnell carry iron swords and leather pouches filled with silver coins. The French crew hauls heavy hemp ropes to raise the canvas sails, and the ship pulls away from the Irish coastline into the Atlantic Ocean. The two earls leave Ireland to seek military funding and soldiers from King Philip III of Spain. 4 years earlier, in 1603, O'Neill knelt on a stone floor at the Mellifont Abbey to sign a peace treaty. Lord Mountjoy accepted the surrender on behalf of the English crown, ending a 9-year conflict known as the 9 Years' War. The English officials presented a written document on parchment, and O'Neill signed his name with iron gall ink. The terms of the treaty forced the earls to disband their private armies. The Crown transferred the legal control of the local timber forests and fishing waters to English administrators. The earls board the French ship in 1607 to secure a foreign army and reverse these territorial losses. A strong Atlantic storm blows the French ship eastward across the English Channel, and the passengers spend 21 days at sea. The captain docks the vessel on October 4th, 1607, at the port of Quillebeuf in the Normandy region of France. The Irish lords disembark onto the wooden docks and travel overland through France and the Spanish Netherlands using horse-drawn wooden carriages. The carriage wheels turn over dirt roads and cobblestone streets as the horses pull the wooden frames through the walled city of Leuven. The group crosses the snow-covered peaks of the Alps in the early spring, and they arrive in the city of Rome in April 1608. Pope Paul V grants the exiled earls a stone residence and a monthly stipend of gold and silver coins. King Philip III of Spain recently signed the Treaty of London in 1604, establishing a formal peace with England. King Philip honors this treaty, and he denies O'Neill's request for Spanish infantry. Word of the departure reaches London, and King James I signs a royal proclamation at Whitehall Palace. He declares the flight of the earls an act of open treason against the English crown. Sir Arthur Chichester serves as the Lord Deputy of Ireland. Chichester receives the king's written proclamation at Dublin Castle, and he dispatches heavily armed English soldiers into the northern province of Ulster. The soldiers march in formation along the dirt roads. They seize the stone castles and garrison the fortresses previously occupied by the O'Neill and O'Donnell families. The royal courts in Dublin issue bills of attainder against the exiles. A bill of attainder is a legislative act that declares a person guilty of treason and seizes their property. The courts formally strip the exiled lords of their aristocratic titles, and the English crown takes direct ownership of 500,000 acres of land across Ulster. Royal surveyors travel into the northern counties carrying iron measuring chains and brass compasses. The surveyors walk across the peat bogs, the pasture lands, and the river valleys. They map the terrain of 6 counties: Armagh, Cavan, Coleraine, Donegal, Fermanagh, and Tyrone. The 6 counties contain thick stands of timber, fast-flowing rivers filled with salmon, and deep valleys suitable for grazing cattle. The surveyors stretch their iron chains across the grass to establish property lines, and they drive wooden stakes into the soil to mark the boundaries of new estates. They record the acreage of arable farmland and the density of the oak forests in large leather-bound ledger books. This massive property transfer removes the highest level of Gaelic leadership from the northern province. Sir Arthur Chichester sits at a wooden desk in Dublin and writes letters to King James. He outlines a comprehensive colonization strategy for the 6 confiscated counties. The plan requires replacing the native Irish tenant farmers with Protestant settlers from England and Scotland. King James approves the proposal in London. The royal administration prints paper charters to recruit wealthy investors from the City of London and the Scottish Lowlands. The government prepares to divide the 500,000 acres into individual estates, officially launching the colonisation scheme known as the Plantation of Ulster. In 1609, King James I signs a royal charter at Whitehall Palace in London. The royal clerks print paper copies of a document titled The Orders and Conditions. Couriers riding horses transport these printed documents along the dirt roads to the Scottish Lowlands and the English shires. The text outlines the strict legal requirements for the colonisation scheme known as the Plantation of Ulster. The royal government divides the confiscated lands across the counties of Armagh, Cavan, Coleraine, Donegal, Fermanagh, and Tyrone. The surveyors carve these territories into distinct parcels measuring 1,000, 1,500, and 2,000 acres. The king offers these land parcels to wealthy British men, known as undertakers. The undertakers sign written contracts binding them to specific construction and population quotas. An undertaker purchasing a 2,000-acre parcel agrees to build a stone castle surrounded by a defensive stone courtyard wall called a bawn. An undertaker purchasing a 1,500-acre parcel agrees to construct a large stone or brick house enclosed by a stone bawn. An undertaker buying a 1,000-acre parcel agrees to build a timber-framed house and a protective bawn. The royal charter requires the undertakers to populate their estates exclusively with British Protestant tenants. For every 1,000 acres of land, the undertaker must transport 24 able-bodied men from England or Scotland. These 24 men must represent at least 10 distinct families. The undertakers instruct these men to sign the Oath of Supremacy, a legal document swearing loyalty to the king as the supreme governor of the church. The men and women pack wooden crates with iron hammers, cross-cut saws, woolen blankets, and brass cooking kettles. They travel to the western coastal ports of Scotland and England. They board wooden merchant ships equipped with large canvas sails. The sailors pull heavy hemp ropes to catch the wind, and the ships sail across the cold, turbulent waters of the Irish Sea. The vessels dock at deep water ports in Derry and Carrickfergus. The passengers walk down wooden gangplanks carrying their heavy crates onto the stone piers. The undertakers lead their new tenants inland along the dirt paths and river valleys to their assigned land parcels. The settlers immediately begin clearing the land for construction. Men swing iron axes to cut down mature oak and ash trees. Draft horses wearing leather harnesses drag the heavy logs out of the forests. Stone masons use iron chisels and wooden mallets to shape rough blocks of limestone and sandstone. The masons mix crushed lime, sand, and water to create mortar. They lay the stones to build the defensive bawns. The bawn walls stand 14 feet high and measure 2 feet thick. The masons cut narrow vertical slits into the stone walls to serve as firing ports for matchlock muskets. Inside the bawns, carpenters assemble timber frames for houses and cover the pitched roofs with overlapping slates or layered river reeds. The settlers reshape the physical landscape to support intense agriculture. They dig deep trenches in the wet earth to drain water away from the fields. Oxen pull iron-tipped plows through the ground to break up the dense root systems of the native grass. The farmers plant seeds of wheat, barley, and oats in the dark, overturned soil. They construct water mills along the fast-flowing rivers. The river currents push heavy wooden water wheels, turning large internal grinding stones to crush the harvested grain into flour. Blacksmiths build stone forges and pump leather bellows to heat coal fires. They hammer glowing strips of iron to produce horseshoes, nails, and ploughshares. The royal administrators relocate the native Irish population away from the prime agricultural zones. The surveyors designate specific sections of rocky, mountainous land for the native Irish grantees. The government places military veterans, known as servitors, on estates located between the native Irish lands and the new British settlements. The servitors build their own fortified bournes and maintain stockpiles of gunpowder and lead musket balls. English soldiers wearing steel breastplates patrol the dirt roads, connecting the newly established towns to enforce the territorial boundaries. King James commands the wealthy trade guilds of London to fund the colonization of County Coleraine. 12 major guilds, including the mercers, the grocers, and the drapers, form a joint stock company called the Irish Society in 1610. They collect silver coins from their members to finance the construction of 2 new settlements. The royal administration officially renames County Coleraine to County Londonderry. The Irish Society sends master carpenters and bricklayers from London across the sea to build the town of Coleraine and the city of Londonderry. The labourers dig deep foundation trenches and erect thick defensive walls around the city of Londonderry. The stone and earth walls measure 24 feet high. The workers pack the top of the walls with wide dirt ramparts, creating a stable platform for mounting heavy bronze cannons. While the government-sponsored plantation transforms these 6 western and central counties, a separate colonization effort takes place on the eastern edge of the province. Wealthy men secure private royal grants for massive tracts of land located outside the official plantation boundaries in County Antrim and County Down. They recruit thousands of lowland Scots to cross the narrow North Channel and establish private farming communities along the eastern coastline. In 1603, King James I signs a parchment document granting 300,000 acres of land to Randall MacDonell. MacDonell takes direct control of a coastal territory in County Antrim, bordered by the River Bann on the west and the Irish Sea on the east. He rides a horse across the hexagonal basalt rock formations of the northern coastline and inspects the deep, narrow glens cutting through the elevated plateau. MacDonell travels across the North Channel to the Scottish lowlands to recruit tenant farmers to work this vast estate. He offers land leases to families living in the Scottish shires of Ayrshire and Galloway. Men and women load their iron spades, brass cooking pots, and wooden spinning wheels onto small single-masted sailing vessels called gabbards. They cross the 13-mile stretch of salt water separating the Kintyre Peninsula in Scotland from the Antrim coast in Ireland. South of Antrim, a native Irish lord named Con O'Neill occupies a large estate in County Down called Clandeboy. In 1603, English soldiers arrest O'Neill following a violent physical altercation between his followers and English troops in the settlement of Belfast. The soldiers confine O'Neill inside the thick stone walls of Carrickfergus Castle. A Scottish aristocrat named Hugh Montgomery operates an estate in Ayrshire, directly across the water from County Down. In 1606, Montgomery orchestrates O'Neill's escape from the stone castle. Montgomery uses small merchant boats to transport O'Neill across the sea to the Scottish coastline. Montgomery secures a royal pardon for O'Neill from King James I in London. The king requires O'Neill to surrender 2/3 of his ancestral lands in County Down to secure his freedom. The king divides the surrendered land between Hugh Montgomery and another Scottish noble named James Hamilton. Hamilton and Montgomery take direct control of the northern half of County Down. They dispatch land agents on horseback into the Scottish counties of Dumfries, Renfrewshire, and Lanarkshire. The agents nail printed paper notices to wooden church doors, advertising cheap land rents and long lease terms in Ulster. Hundreds of Scottish families walk to the western ports of Portpatrick and Irvine. They pay silver coins to boat captains for passage across the Irish Sea. The ships navigate the strong tidal currents and arrive at the natural harbours of Donaghadee and Bangor on the coast of County Down. The Scottish tenants walk down the wooden planks, carrying sacks of seed grain and leading live cattle by hemp ropes. The Scottish farmers clear the coastal lowlands using heavy iron broadaxes. They chop down the native alder and willow trees growing along the river banks. They construct residential cabins using overlapping wooden boards and pack the roof with dried heather gathered from the hills. They plough the cleared soil using a heavy wooden plough called a Scotch plough. A team of 4 horses pulls the plough through the damp earth, carving deep furrows. The farmers plant barley and specialized strains of oats, adapted to the cold, wet climate. They harvest the mature oats with curved iron sickles. They bind the cut stalks into sheaves and stack them in the fields to dry in the wind. The settlers introduce new breeds of livestock to the Irish pastures. They graze hornless Galloway cattle and black-faced sheep on the grassy hillsides. The women shear the sheep using iron scissors and spin the raw wool into yarn using wooden spinning wheels driven by foot pedals. They weave the yarn into thick cloth on wooden hand looms inside their cabins. They churn cow's milk into butter using tall wooden plunge churns bound with iron hoops. The families sustain themselves through the freezing winters by eating salted beef, oatcakes, and stored root vegetables. By 1614, thousands of Scottish farmers plough the fields and herd cattle across the 2 eastern counties. They bring their own religious leaders across the sea to conduct religious services. Presbyterian ministers travel from the Scottish lowlands and stand inside stone churches to read aloud from heavy leather-bound Bibles. The congregants sit on wooden benches and sing religious psalms using strictly their combined voices. The Scottish dialect replaces the native Gaelic language in the local markets and trading posts. Farmers exchange iron tools, leather boots, and woven cloth using Scottish copper and silver currency. The private colonization of Antrim and Down operates as a separate geographic entity from the official government plantation scheme occurring in the western counties. The population density in these 2 private eastern settlements quickly surpasses the population density of the government-sponsored zones. The growing population necessitates centralized locations for trade, religious worship, and civil administration. Hamilton, Montgomery, and MacDonnell hire stonemasons and carpenters to construct formal settlements along the natural waterways and coastal harbors. The laborers dig deep foundation trenches and cut square limestone blocks to build permanent urban centers. English and Scottish architects draw paper blueprints for street grids, marketplaces, and defensive walls. The workers mix crushed lime and water in large wooden troughs and lay the first foundation stones for the new towns of Belfast, Bangor, and Newtownards. In 1611, English and Scottish labourers begin constructing the town of Belfast at the mouth of the River Lagan. Sir Arthur Chichester employs brickmakers to dig local clay from the riverbanks. The workers mould the wet clay into rectangular blocks and fire them in wood-burning kilns. They transport the red bricks using horse-drawn wooden carts to build a large residence called Belfast Castle. Scottish masons cut local sandstone to lay the foundation for a central market cross. King James I signs a charter incorporating Belfast as a municipal borough in 1613. Town officials establish a weekly market held every Friday. Farmers from the surrounding countryside bring wooden carts filled with cabbages, carrots, and salted pork to trade for manufactured goods. In the coastal town of Bangor, Sir James Hamilton directs workers to construct a stone custom house near the wooden docks. The king grants a separate charter authorizing a provost and 12 burgesses to govern Bangor. The burgesses collect taxes in silver shillings to maintain the paved cobblestone streets. Further west, labourers working for the Irish Society construct a massive defensive perimeter around the settlement of Derry. Between 1613 and 1618, stone masons erect a continuous wall measuring 1 mile in circumference. The 12 London livery companies finance the wall construction with £40,000 of silver. The workers lay blocks of slate and local greenstone to build a wall 20 feet high and 24 feet wide. They pack the center of the double stone walls with compacted earth and clay to absorb the kinetic impact of artillery fire. Laborers install 4 large wooden gates, named Bishop Gate, Ferryquay Gate, Butcher Gate, and Shipquay Gate. They hang these heavy oak doors on forged iron hinges to control access to the interior streets. Workers transport heavy bronze cannons by ship from the Tower of London to the docks of Derry. Artillerymen mount the cannons, including models called sakers and culverins, onto wooden gun carriages positioned along the wide earth-packed ramparts. The settlers establish a linen weaving industry along the fast-flowing river valleys of the northern province. Farmers plant flax seeds in the damp soil during the spring months of April and May. The flax plants grow to 3 feet in height and produce small blue flowers in the summer. Men and women harvest the crop by pulling the entire plant out of the soil by the roots. They submerge the tied bundles of flax into stagnant pools of water weighed down by heavy river stones for 10 to 14 days. This process, called retting, rots the outer bark of the plant. The workers remove the bundles, dry them in the wind, and strike the stalks with wooden blades called scutching swords. This physical beating separates the woody core from the soft inner fibers. Women spin these long fibers into linen thread using wooden spinning wheels. Weavers operate large wooden hand looms to interlace the thread into long sheets of flat brown linen cloth. They carry the heavy rolls to flat, open fields called bleach greens. They soak the brown linen in a mixture of water and alkaline ash derived from burned kelp. They spread the wet cloth flat across the short grass and expose it to the sunlight for several weeks. The ultraviolet light and the oxygen from the grass chemically react to turn the fabric completely white. The Scottish immigrants bring their religious practices directly into these new urban centres. In 1613, Reverend Edward Bryce travels from Stirlingshire to County Antrim. He serves as the first Presbyterian minister to conduct services in the province. Masons construct rectangular stone churches with slate roofs to house the growing congregations. Carpenters build elevated wooden pulpits in the center of the main room using oak beams. The ministers stand on these raised platforms and read aloud from the heavy, leather-bound Geneva Bible. The congregants sit on wooden pews and sing the Psalms of David, relying entirely on their combined human voices. The Scottish congregations organize their communities according to the Presbyterian Book of Discipline. The ministers appoint local men to serve as church elders, forming a governing body called a kirk session. The session meets inside the stone churches to enforce behavioral rules. The elders collect copper coins in hollowed-out wooden boxes attached to long ash poles to distribute to the impoverished members of the settlement. Over 40,000 Scottish and English settlers occupy the 6 plantation counties and the private estates of Antrim and Down by 1640. The men clear the native oak forests using iron broadaxes to expand the agricultural footprint around the towns. Surveyors design a network of dirt roads connecting the isolated market centers. Workers break large limestone rocks into gravel using heavy iron sledgehammers and lay the crushed stone to stabilize the roads against the heavy rainfall. Pack horses wearing leather saddlebags transport bundles of woven linen and sacks of barley along these overland routes. The settlers construct 2-story, timber-framed houses using overlapping oak planks called weatherboarding. They install lead-lined glass windows in the upper floors to let in sunlight and hold the heat inside the structure. The native Irish population living in the surrounding hills observes the physical expansion of the walled towns. Heavy rains and cold temperatures ruin the native oat harvests in the autumn of 1641. Sir Phelim O'Neill meets with Rory O'More and Lord Maguire to discuss the logistics of an armed uprising. They gather in hidden forest encampments and stockpile iron-tipped pikes, heavy axes, and long knives. They assign specific targets to regional commanders, directing them to seize the stone bournes, the armories, and the unprotected farming settlements. They schedule the synchronized assault for the evening of October 22nd, 1641. On the evening of October 22nd, 1641, Sir Phelim O'Neill arrives at the gates of Charlemont Fort in County Armagh. He carries a forged paper document bearing a wax seal, presenting it as a commission from King Charles I. Lord Caulfield commands the garrison and opens the heavy wooden gates to host O'Neill for a scheduled dinner. O'Neill's men draw concealed iron daggers from their wool cloaks and seize the English soldiers. They lock Lord Caulfield inside a stone holding cell and take control of the fortress armory. The coordinated uprising spreads across the province of Ulster during the night. Native Irish forces attack the scattered Scottish and English farming settlements. The attackers carry wooden pikes tipped with forged iron spikes and heavy agricultural scythes. They break down the wooden doors of the timber-framed cabins using iron sledgehammers. They set fire to the thatched roofs using burning bundles of dried river reeds. The fire burns the overlapping wooden weatherboards and the interior oak frames. The native Irish tenant farmers target the agricultural infrastructure built by the planters. They drive the hornless Galloway cattle and black-faced sheep out of the defensive stone bournes. They herd the livestock into the dense forests and the elevated mountain passes. They swing iron axes to smash the wooden spinning wheels and the wooden hand looms used for making linen. They shatter the flat rotary quern stones used for grinding oats. They ignite the harvested oat sheaves stacked in the open fields, turning the winter food supply into white ash. Displaced Scottish and English settlers flee their burning farms in the middle of the night. Men, women, and children walk along the dirt roads through the freezing rain toward the fortified towns. Hundreds of settlers march toward the walled city of Londonderry. They pass through the heavy oak doors of the Shipquay Gate and take shelter behind the 24-foot-wide stone walls. The winter of 1641 brings severe frost and heavy snowfall to the province. Settlers wearing only thin linen shirts freeze to death in the mud along the roadsides. Irish rebel forces capture the town of Armagh and the surrounding villages. In November 1641, a group of rebels marches 100 Protestant settlers to a wooden bridge crossing the River Bann near the town of Portadown. The rebels force the prisoners off the wooden planks into the freezing water. The fast-flowing river current pulls the men and women under the surface. The bodies wash up on the muddy banks of the river over the following weeks. In the northwest counties, Sir William Stewart and Sir Robert Stewart issue written orders to the remaining Scottish and English farmers. They organize the survivors into a mobile militia known as the Lagan Army. The Stewart brothers consolidate their forces at the stone fortresses of Raphoe and Derry. They melt scrap lead in iron crucibles over coal fires to cast spherical musket balls. The soldiers cut small patches of linen cloth to wrap the lead balls, creating a tight seal inside the iron musket barrels. The men carry long wooden pikes to protect the musketeers from approaching cavalry. On June 16, 1642, the Lagan army intercepts Sir Phelim O'Neill's forces at the Battle of Glenmaquin. The Stewart brothers command 500 cavalrymen riding small hobbler ponies and 2,000 infantrymen walking on foot. The militia forms rigid linear lines across the grass valley. The soldiers light the slow-burning hemp matches on their muskets and fire synchronized volleys of lead balls into the advancing Irish lines. The lead projectiles pierce the wool clothing and flesh of the rebel fighters. O'Neill's army breaks formation and retreats across the Raphoe valleys, leaving hundreds of dead men bleeding in the mud. Across the North Channel, the Scottish government collects taxes in silver merks to fund a professional military expedition. The Scottish Parliament purchases transport ships, gunpowder, and iron weapons. Major General Robert Monro takes command of this newly formed army. On April 15, 1642, Monro lands 2,500 Scottish soldiers at the deep water port of Carrickfergus on the eastern coast of County Antrim. The soldiers walk down the wooden planks carrying 14-foot iron-tipped pikes and heavy matchlock muskets. They wear thick wool coats dyed in a specific shade of brown and grey called hodden grey. The soldiers wear iron skull caps called secretes underneath their knitted wool bonnets to deflect sword strikes. They carry canvas knapsacks filled with dried oats and salted herring to sustain themselves on the march. Monro establishes his military headquarters inside the thick stone walls of Carrickfergus Castle. He orders his men to dig deep earthen trenches outside the castle walls using iron spades. The Scottish troops march south toward the town of Newry. They use iron pickaxes to breach the stone walls of captured castles. They hang captured rebels from the thick branches of mature oak trees using hemp ropes. Monro's men arrest the Earl of Antrim, Randall MacDonnell, at his estate in Dunluce. The soldiers march him to Carrickfergus and lock him inside a stone cell. The Scottish army secures the eastern coastline, establishing a fortified perimeter to protect the newly arriving ships, bringing reinforcements from Scotland. While the soldiers fight in the mud of Ulster, the Scottish Presbyterians gather at the Greyfriars Kirkyard in Edinburgh. They sign a large parchment document stating their refusal to accept the king's appointed bishops in their churches. King Charles I orders his military commanders to deploy horse-mounted dragoons across the Scottish lowlands to arrest the men who signed the parchment. On February 28, 1638, Scottish nobles, ministers, and farmers gather inside the stone walls of Greyfriars Kirkyard in Edinburgh. They unroll a flat animal skin parchment measuring 46 inches in length. A nobleman named Archibald Johnston reads the text of this document, known as the National Covenant. The text documents a sworn agreement to maintain the Presbyterian church structure and block the installation of royal bishops. The men in the churchyard dip goose quill pens into glass inkwells filled with dark iron gall ink. They press the wet nibs against the parchment to sign their names. Messengers carry handwritten copies of the document on horseback through the Scottish lowlands. Hundreds of thousands of people add their signatures to the copied parchments over the following months. In 1660, King Charles II reclaims the English and Scottish thrones. He signs a legal document called the Rescissory Act in 1661. This legislation cancels all previous laws protecting the Presbyterian church structure. The king appoints new bishops to govern the local Scottish parishes. 300 Presbyterian ministers refuse to swear verbal oaths of loyalty to these royal bishops. The King's Privy Council deploys government soldiers to force these ministers out of their stone churches and their attached timber-framed houses. The displaced ministers walk out of the towns and into the steep, rocky valleys of the Scottish landscape. Thousands of men, women, and children follow them into the heather moors and the damp peat bogs. The ministers stand on flat granite boulders and read aloud from heavy leather-bound Bibles. The congregants sit on the wet moss and sing religious psalms. They call these illegal open-air religious services conventicles. Men form protective perimeters around the sitting crowds. They stand on the high ridges holding 14-foot wooden pikes and heavy iron swords to watch the horizon for approaching royal troops. Before receiving the communion bread, the congregants present small stamped lead coins called communion tokens to the church elders. King Charles II dispatches regiments of horse-mounted soldiers known as dragoons into the lowlands. The dragoons wear red wool coats, iron breastplates, and thick leather riding boots. They carry short-barreled flintlock muskets, called carbines, and curved steel cavalry swords. A commander named John Graham of Claverhouse leads troops through the border regions. The horses trot along the dirt paths and push through the dense green ferns to locate the hidden conventicles. The soldiers ride into the crowds and swing their steel swords to strike the fleeing congregants. They arrest the captured men and tie their hands with rough hemp ropes. The dragoons conduct immediate interrogations in the open fields. The commanding officers demand the prisoners speak an oath, denouncing the national covenant. The prisoners state their refusal. The soldiers point their iron carbines at the heads and chests of the kneeling men. They pull the iron triggers, sparking the flint and igniting the black powder. The lead balls pierce the wool clothing and the flesh. The soldiers leave the bleeding bodies lying in the tall grass and ride away to locate the next gathering. Royal authorities record this specific period of targeted executions in the 1680s as the killing times. Royal magistrates conduct formal trials for captured leaders inside the Edinburgh Tolbooth, a heavy stone prison building. The guards force the prisoners into a specialized torture device constructed from oak and iron called the boot. The guards place the prisoner's leg inside a heavy wooden frame. They use heavy iron mallets to hammer solid iron wedges between the wood and the human leg. The compressive force splinters the tibia and fibula bones. The magistrates record the spoken confessions using ink and paper. The executioners march the convicted men to the grass market in the center of the city. They hang the men by the neck from tall wooden gallows using thick hemp ropes. They use iron axes to sever the heads of the deceased men and mount the skulls on iron spikes above the city gates. The royal judges sentence thousands of surviving Covenanters to forced banishment. Armed guards march the prisoners to the coastal port of Leith. They load the men and women into the dark, damp lower decks of wooden merchant vessels. The captains navigate the ships across the Atlantic Ocean to the English colonies of Virginia, Barbados, and Jamaica. The colonial plantation owners purchase the Scottish prisoners as indentured laborers. The prisoners swing heavy iron machetes to harvest thick stalks of sugarcane under the direct heat of the Caribbean sun. In Virginia, they use heavy iron hoes to chop the soil and plant broad-leafed tobacco plants in the humid coastal environment. Thousands of Scottish Presbyterians evade the dragoons by walking westward toward the coastal ports of Port Patrick and Irvine. They carry their iron cooking pots, brass spoons, and leather-bound Bibles in canvas sacks. They pay silver and copper coins to local boat captains to secure passage across the North Channel. The single-masted wooden boats sail through the cold salt water and dock at the coastal towns of County Antrim and County Down. The religious refugees walk into the established plantation settlements and lease plots of land from the resident landlords. They build timber-framed cabins and plow the damp Ulster soil using heavy wooden plows drawn by oxen. They establish new Presbyterian congregations governed entirely by local church elders. The demographic density of the Scottish population in Ulster continues to climb as the 17th century draws to a close. The political violence pushes thousands of refugees across the sea, and soon a severe shift in the regional climate forces tens of thousands more to follow them. The air temperatures across the Scottish border region drop significantly in the 1690s. The summer sun warms the damp soil for only brief periods, causing the oat crops to rot in the fields before the grain matures. The constant freezing rain destroys the entire harvest, eliminating the primary food supply for the border region from 1696 to 1698. On December 7, 1688, King James II deploys Catholic soldiers, commanded by Alexander MacDonell, to the walled city of Londonderry. 13 young men, working as apprentices inside the city, steal the iron keys to the 4 main gates. They push the heavy oak doors shut and lock the iron bolts as the soldiers approach the River Foyle. 4 months later, on April 18, 1689, King James arrives outside the 24-foot-wide stone walls with an army of Jacobite soldiers. The soldiers dig deep earthen trenches in the damp soil surrounding the city. They position heavy bronze mortar cannons on the high ground overlooking the defensive walls. The defenders inside Londonderry stand on the wide earth-packed ramparts and shout the phrase, "No surrender," at the approaching army. Major General Robert Lundy leaves the city, and Reverend George Walker assumes command of the defending militia. The Jacobite gunners light the fuses on their cannons and fire 200-pound hollow iron shells filled with black powder over the walls. The exploding shells shatter the slate roofs and timber frames of the houses inside the city. The siege lasts for 105 days. The Jacobite soldiers cut down mature oak trees and chain the logs together using forged iron links. They stretch this floating wooden barricade, called a boom, across the River Foyle to trap merchant ships outside the city. The defenders and the civilian population inside the walls consume their stockpiles of salted beef and stored oats. They butcher and boil the cavalry horses to eat the meat. As the summer progresses, they hunt stray dogs and rats running through the stone streets. They cut thick leather animal hides into small squares and boil them in water to chew on the softened material. Thousands of people contract typhus and dysentery from drinking contaminated water drawn from the shallow city wells. The gravediggers bury the dead bodies in mass trenches dug into the dirt courtyards. On July 28, 1689, 3 armed merchant ships sail up the River Foyle. The lead ship, named the Mountjoy, rams its wooden hull directly into the floating oak boom. The iron chains break and the wooden logs splinter. The ships dock at the stone ship quay gate, and the sailors unload hundreds of wooden crates filled with salted pork, hardtack biscuits and flour. The Jacobite army observes the arrival of the food supplies, burns their earthen camps, and marches southward away from the city. 7 years later, the weather patterns across the North Atlantic change significantly. From 1696 to 1698, average temperatures drop across the Scottish lowlands and border regions. A persistent mass of cold air keeps the spring snow frozen upon the ground. The farmers plant oat seeds in the freezing, waterlogged soil. The early autumn frosts kill the green shoots before the grain reaches maturity. The harsh weather destroys the crops for 3 consecutive years, creating a severe regional famine known as the 7 ill years. The rural population exhausts their stored grain reserves. Men and women gather wild roots, boiled nettles, and tree bark to consume. Thousands of tenant farmers die in their timber-framed cottages from malnutrition and related diseases. 50,000 starving lowland Scots leave their farms between 1690 and 1710. They walk to the western ports of Scotland and board single-masted gabbards. They pay the boat captains with copper coins to cross the North Channel. The ships dock at the deep water ports of Belfast, Donaghadee, and Carrickfergus. The Scottish immigrants walk onto the Irish coast and travel into the rural counties of Antrim, Down, and Londonderry. They lease vacant plots of land from the established estate owners. They construct new cabins using overlapping wooden boards and thatch the roofs with dried heather. They plough the dark soil using heavy wooden ploughs drawn by oxen and plant fresh oat seeds. The new farmers build stone Presbyterian churches and send requests back to Scotland for educated ministers to lead the congregations. This massive influx of 50,000 new immigrants drastically alters the demographics of the northern province. The Scottish Presbyterians establish an absolute population majority in Ulster over both the native Irish Catholics and the English Anglicans. They build a self-sustaining agricultural economy based on weaving brown linen cloth and exporting raw flax seed. They form a tight, organized community bound by the strict theological rules of the Presbyterian Kirk Sessions. The growing numeric and economic dominance of these Scottish settlers attracts the attention of the English and Anglo-Irish lawmakers sitting in the Parliament of Ireland in Dublin. The lawmakers draft new legislation designed to legally restrict the civic power of all individuals operating outside the official Anglican Church of Ireland. In March 1704, the Parliament of Ireland convenes inside a brick building on College Green in the city of Dublin. The Anglo-Irish lawmakers sit on wooden benches and pass a piece of legislation called the Test Act. The text of the law requires all civil and military office holders to take communion inside the Anglican Church of Ireland. To verify compliance, an individual must present a paper certificate signed by an Anglican minister and 2 witnesses to a local magistrate. The Scottish Presbyterians living in the northern province of Ulster consume communion bread baked by their own members and distributed by their own ministers inside their own stone churches. The royal government enforces the new Test Act legislation immediately across the island. Royal magistrates remove Presbyterian men from their positions as local judges, postmasters, and town councillors. In the walled city of Londonderry, the magistrates dismiss 10 of the 12 serving aldermen from the city council. In the town of Belfast, the sovereign and the majority of the burgesses surrender their municipal offices to the royal authorities. Military commanders discharge Presbyterian soldiers from the British Army regiments stationed in the Irish garrisons. The Test Act legislation dictates strict regulations regarding marriage and family structures. The ecclesiastical courts recognize only marriages performed by ordained Anglican priests using the Book of Common Prayer. Couples married by Presbyterian ministers face prosecution in the parish courts for the crime of fornication. The court clerks record the children of these Presbyterian marriages as illegitimate on the official paper registries. The legal code directs the inheritance of the family property to the nearest Anglican relative or transfers the land lease directly back to the estate owner. Alongside the religious laws, the Scottish tenant farmers face severe economic pressures from the Anglo-Irish landowners. During the early 17th century, the original plantation undertakers signed 31-year land leases with the first wave of Scottish settlers. These long-term leases expire in the first decade of the 18th century. The tenant farmers cleared the native oak forests, drained the waterlogged peat bogs, and built two-story stone houses on the land. The landlords observed the increased agricultural output and the physical improvements made to the properties. The landlords hire land agents known as middlemen to extract more revenue. These middlemen organize public land auctions called cantings. The middlemen stand in the town squares and invite competing bids for the newly expired leases, a practice known as rack renting. They demand double or triple the amount of silver coins for the annual rent. Native Irish farmers, possessing a lower standard of living and a willingness to pool their resources, form joint partnerships to outbid the Scottish tenants. The middlemen grant the new leases to the highest bidders, and the Scottish farmers surrender the stone houses they built. The Scottish farmers also pay a mandatory religious tax called a tithe to support the Anglican Church of Ireland. The Anglican clergy employ men called tithe proctors to collect the goods. The proctors walk the property lines of the Ulster farms every autumn. They take 1/10 of the harvested oat crops, 1/10 of the woven brown linen cloth, and 1/10 of the newborn calves. The farmers load the heavy sacks of grain onto wooden carts and deliver them to the Anglican parish storehouses. The farmers pay this tax to the Anglican Church while simultaneously paying copper coins to support their own Presbyterian ministers. In 1718, a severe drought strikes the province of Ulster. The dry summer air hardens the soil into thick clay crusts. The flax plants wither into brittle stalks, stopping the production of linen thread. A disease called sheep rot spreads through the grazing herds on the Antrim and Down hillsides. The sick sheep shed their wool and collapse on the short grass. Smallpox outbreaks spread through the densely populated market towns, causing high mortality rates among the young children and the elderly residents. The combination of the Test Act, the rack renting auctions, the mandatory tithes, and the crop failures pushes the Scottish Presbyterians to leave the province. Presbyterian ministers stand in their elevated wooden pulpits and read letters sent from the English colonies in North America. The letters describe vast tracts of forested land in the provinces of Pennsylvania and Maryland. The letters detail laws permitting open religious practices and advertise land leases priced at a few copper pence per acre. The tenant farmers pack their iron tools, brass cooking kettles, and heavy leather-bound Bibles into wooden crates. They trade their remaining cattle and heavy wooden spinning wheels for silver coins at the local markets. They load their crates onto horse-drawn carts and walk along the dirt roads toward the deep water ports of Belfast and Londonderry to board wooden merchant ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean. In 1682, Reverend William Trail packs his leather-bound books and leaves the town of Lifford in County Donegal. He boards a wooden merchant ship and crosses the Atlantic Ocean to the province of Maryland. He purchases a tract of land along the Pocomoke River in Somerset County. He oversees the construction of a timber-framed church building. The next year, in 1683, another Presbyterian minister named Francis Makemie sails from County Donegal to the eastern shore of Maryland. Makemie travels by small riverboat along the Chesapeake Bay. He trades raw tobacco leaves for silver coins and purchases property in Accomack County, Virginia. He organizes the local farmers into the first formal Presbyterian presbytery in North America in 1706. The men gather inside a wooden meeting house in Philadelphia to establish the church administration. Merchant ships carrying physical cargo establish a regular transit route across the Atlantic Ocean. Pennsylvania and New York farmers harvest mature flax plants exclusively for the seeds. They use heavy wooden flails to beat the dried plants and extract the brown seeds. They pour the seeds into oak barrels bound with split hickory hoops. Stevedores load these heavy barrels onto the merchant ships. The ships sail the North Atlantic route to the Irish ports of Belfast, Londonderry, and Larne. The Ulster farmers buy this imported seed because they harvest their own flax before the plants produce mature seeds, prioritizing the soft green stems for linen production. The ship captains discharge the flaxseed barrels and scrub the lower cargo decks with salt water and vinegar. They prepare the empty wooden space to transport human passengers back to the American colonies. The passage costs £5 per adult. Many tenant farmers lack the silver coins required to pay this fare. They sign paper contracts called indentures with the ship captains. The farmers agree to work as unpaid laborers for a period of 4 to 7 years to pay the debt. Families walk to the deep water ports of Belfast and Larne, carrying their possessions in stitched canvas sacks. They board merchant vessels measuring 90 to 120 feet in length, equipped with 3 large pine masts and square canvas sails. The captains register the names and ages of the passengers in large leather-bound ledger books using iron gall ink. The crew members direct the passengers down steep wooden ladders into the steerage deck. The distance between the wooden floorboards and the overhead ceiling beams measures exactly 4 feet and 6 inches. Adult men and women walk through the steerage bent at the waist. Carpenters nail rough pine planks together to form continuous sleeping platforms along the curved inner hull of the ship. 6 individuals lie shoulder to shoulder on a single wooden platform measuring 6 feet wide and 6 feet long. They cover themselves with woven wool blankets. The ship captains weigh the heavy iron anchors and pilot the vessels out of the coastal bays into the open Atlantic Ocean. The journey spans 3,000 miles of deep water and takes 8 to 10 weeks to complete. The ships sail westward, fighting against the prevailing easterly winds and the strong current of the Gulf Stream. Heavy storms push fast-moving saltwater waves over the wooden deck rails. The sailors secure the heavy wooden hatch covers over the steerage deck and seal the edges with thick canvas tarpaulins to block the seawater from flooding the lower decks. The passengers sit in complete darkness for several days as the wooden hull pitches and rolls in the turbulent ocean swells. The ship's cook stands in the galley and boils salted beef and dried peas in large copper kettles. The crew distributes the daily food rations to the steerage passengers. Each adult receives 1 pound of hardtack biscuits, half a pound of salted meat, and a wooden cup of raw oatmeal. The passengers rely on fresh water stored in massive wooden casks. The ambient heat in the lower hull causes algae and bacteria to multiply in the stagnant water. The cramped physical conditions in the unventilated steerage deck promote the rapid spread of infectious diseases. Human body lice crawl through the thick wool clothing of the passengers, carrying the bacteria that causes epidemic typhus. The infected passengers develop high fevers, severe muscle pain, and dark red rashes on their chests and arms. The ship's surgeon treats the sick patients by pressing small steel lancets into their veins to drain blood into brass bowls. A separate bacterial infection causes dysentery, leading to severe dehydration. The death rate on the transatlantic crossing reaches 20% on the most crowded ships. The crew members wrap the deceased men, women, and children in heavy canvas sailcloth. They stitch the canvas closed, using iron needles, and place heavy iron ballast stones at the feet. They carry the canvas bags to the wooden deck rails and drop the bodies into the deep ocean water. The surviving passengers endure the confined conditions until the sailors spot the coastal landmass of North America. The ships navigate the entrance of the Delaware Bay and sail up the wide Delaware River. The captains drop the iron anchors near the wooden docks of Newcastle in the Delaware colony and Philadelphia in the Pennsylvania colony. The passengers climb the steep wooden ladders out of the steerage deck and walk down the wooden gangplanks onto the dirt and cobblestone streets. The indentured laborers stand in the open squares, while local farmers and merchants purchase their paper contracts with silver coins. The free immigrants buy iron axes and crosscut saws from the local blacksmiths. They walk westward along the dirt trails, leading away from the coastal ports. Colonial governors stand on the docks and watch the immigrants carry their iron tools. The governors write letters to the British Parliament requesting more Scottish farmers to cut the western forests. In the spring of 1718, Reverend William Boyd packs a signed parchment petition into his leather bag and boards a ship bound for the province of Massachusetts Bay, initiating the first massive organized migration of the Ulster Scots. In the spring of 1718, Reverend William Boyd disembarks from a wooden merchant ship at the cobblestone docks of Boston in the province of Massachusetts Bay. He carries a rolled parchment document inside a leather satchel. This document is a formal petition signed by the heads of 319 Ulster Scots families living in the Bann Valley of Northern Ireland. 315 of these men dipped goose quill pens into iron gall ink to sign their own names in cursive script. 4 men drew an iron cross on the parchment to mark their identity. The local Presbyterian ministers in Ulster teach the farmers to read the printed text of the Geneva Bible. Boyd walks through the brick streets of Boston to the Province House, the official residence of the colonial governor. Boyd presents the unrolled parchment to Governor Samuel Shute. Governor Shute unrolls paper maps of the New England colonies across a wide oak table. He observes the unmapped territories of the northern frontier, stretching into the regions of modern-day Maine and New Hampshire. French military officers and allied indigenous tribes control the land immediately north of these borders. Governor Shute signs a land grant offering the Ulster families forested tracts along the eastern coastline and the inland river valleys. He positions these armed settlers along the northern boundary to protect the coastal commercial centers of Massachusetts from opposing forces. Boyd writes letters on paper and sends them across the Atlantic Ocean on returning merchant ships. The paper letters arrive in the Ulster parishes of Agadowie and McCosquin. Reverend James McGregor reads the letters aloud to his congregation inside a stone church. The tenant farmers return to their timber-framed houses and begin packing their physical belongings. They place iron broadaxes, brass cooking kettles, and wooden spinning wheels into pine crates. They sell their remaining cattle and sheep to native Irish farmers for silver coins. They load their heavy crates onto wooden carts drawn by horses and travel to the coastal ports of Coleraine and Londonderry. In the summer of 1718, The families board a fleet of 5 wooden sailing ships. The fleet includes vessels named the William and Mary, the McCallum, the William and Elizabeth, and the Mary and Elizabeth. The sailors raise the heavy canvas sails, and the 5 ships navigate out of the coastal bays into the deep water of the North Atlantic. The journey takes 8 weeks. The passengers consume salted beef and dried oats while sitting in the dark steerage decks below the waterline. The 5 ships sail into Boston Harbor in August 1718. Hundreds of Ulster Scots immigrants walk down the wooden gangplanks carrying their heavy crates. The local Puritan residents of Boston observe the arrival of these new settlers. The town constables record the names of the arriving families in leather ledger books. The arrival of hundreds of people quickly depletes the stored grain and available timber-framed housing in the port. A large group of the immigrants boards smaller coastal vessels and sails northward to Casco Bay in the region of Maine. The ships drop their iron anchors in Casco Bay in the late autumn. The ocean water freezes around the wooden hulls of the ships. The families spend the winter of 1718 living inside the freezing holds of the trapped vessels. The air temperature drops below freezing, and the thick sea ice locks the vessels in place. They consume the last of their dried provisions. When the ice melts in the spring of 1719, the surviving families sail southward to the mouth of the Merrimack River. They navigate small wooden boats up the river current and walk inland to a tract of land called Nutfield in the province of New Hampshire. The settlers use iron axes to chop down thick eastern white pine trees. They build residential cabins by stacking the horizontal pine logs and filling the gaps with wet clay. They plant specialized seed potatoes brought directly from Ulster into the rocky soil. The farmers harvest the mature tubers in the autumn, expanding the cultivation of the white potato into the New England colonies. The women use wooden spinning wheels to spin raw flax fibers into linen thread, continuing the textile manufacturing practices developed in the Irish river valleys. The settlers petition the colonial government to change the name of their settlement, and the magistrates officially rename the town Londonderry, New Hampshire. Back in the Massachusetts colony, the local magistrates strictly enforce the laws of the established Congregational Church. The colonial laws require the newly arrived Presbyterian immigrants to pay a mandatory tax in copper and silver coins to support the local congregational ministers. The Ulster Scots build their own timber-framed Presbyterian meeting house in the town of Worcester. In 1738, local Congregationalist men walk to the construction site carrying iron axes and heavy wooden mallets. They strike the timber frames and dismantle the structure during the night. They scatter the wooden beams across the dirt field. The colonial tax collectors continue to demand silver coins from the Ulster Scots. The immigrants pack their belongings and search for alternative settlement locations. The ship captains sitting in the Boston taverns describe the geographic conditions of the middle colonies. They speak of wide, navigable rivers, dense hardwood forests, and deep topsoil suitable for heavy agriculture. They outline the specific legal codes drafted by the colonial administrators in those southern territories, permitting varied religious practices. The letters sent back to the Ulster ports in the 1720s redirect the destination of the departing merchant ships. The ship captains plot new navigational charts, steering the wooden vessels away from the rocky coastline of New England and southward toward the wide mouth of the Delaware River and the deep water ports of Pennsylvania. During the 1720s, wooden merchant vessels sail up the wide channel of the Delaware River. Ship captains navigate the deep currents and drop heavy iron anchors near the timber docks of Philadelphia in the province of Pennsylvania and the town of Newcastle in the Delaware colony. Thousands of Scottish Presbyterian immigrants walk down the wooden gangplanks carrying stitched canvas sacks and iron tools. They step onto the cobblestone streets and walk toward the Colonial Land Office. The province of Pennsylvania operates under a legal document called the Frame of Government, written by William Penn in 1682. This parchment document legally guarantees the right of residents to practice any religion without paying mandatory taxes to an established state church. The newly arrived immigrants stand in the land office and exchange silver shillings for printed paper land patents. The colonial clerks record their names in heavy leather ledger books using iron gall ink. The immigrants load their heavy brass cooking kettles and wooden spinning wheels onto horse-drawn wooden carts. They walk westward out of the port cities along dirt roads heavily rutted by wagon wheels. They cross the Schuylkill River and enter the rolling hills of Chester County and Lancaster County. The settlers guide their horses along the banks of Brandywine Creek and Octoraro Creek. The physical landscape consists of dense hardwood forests filled with mature white oak, shagbark hickory, and black walnut trees. The settlers stop their carts in the river valleys and begin to alter the terrain. Two men stand on opposite sides of a thick oak trunk, holding the wooden handles of a steel crosscut saw. They push and pull the steel blade through the dense wood fibers to fell the timber. For the larger trees, men swing heavy iron broadaxes to cut a continuous ring around the base of the trunk. This technique, called girdling, severs the vascular tissue of the tree beneath the bark. The tree dies, and the leaves fall to the ground, allowing direct sunlight to reach the soil below. The farmers leave the dead trees standing in the soil and drag the fallen branches into large piles to burn. The wood ash creates a thick layer of potassium-rich fertilizer on the ground. The farmers use heavy iron hoes to break apart the thick root systems of the native grasses. The women walk behind the men and drop seeds of wheat and yellow Indian corn into the overturned earth. They plant the corn in small mounds of dirt, placed 3 feet apart. The summer heat and frequent rain showers water the crops. In the autumn, the farmers harvest the mature wheat using curved iron sickles. They transport the grain to stone grist mills built along the fast-flowing streams. The moving water turns large wooden wheels attached to heavy circular grinding stones. The heavy stones crush the wheat kernels into white flour. The women bake this flour into flatbreads in stone hearths. They feed the surplus yellow corn directly to black-faced sheep and hornless Galloway cattle grazing in the open pastures. James Logan serves as the provincial secretary of Pennsylvania. He was born in the town of Lurgan, in the northern province of Ulster, and manages the distribution of land for the Penn family. Logan writes paper letters to the colonial administrators using a goose quill pen. In 1729, he writes a document describing a specific strategy to secure the western perimeter of the colony. He directs the newly arriving Ulster Scots immigrants to settle along the eastern banks of the Susquehanna River. Logan positions these armed farmers as a physical barrier between the pacifist Quaker settlements near Philadelphia and the indigenous Lenape and Shawnee tribes living in the western forests. The provincial government grants the immigrants large tracts of land in a designated area called Conestoga Manor, a territory measuring 15,000 acres. The immigrants build timber-framed cabins and stone Presbyterian churches along the Susquehanna River. They form local militias and stockpile lead musket balls and black powder inside their homes. The population of Ulster Scots in the region increases rapidly throughout the 1720s and 1730s. The boundaries of the original land grants quickly fill with new farms and pastures. The younger generations of farmers cross the Susquehanna River and walk further west into the Cumberland Valley. They mark new property lines by carving deep notches into the bark of boundary trees using iron hatchets. They build new settlements directly on top of established indigenous hunting grounds. The Lenape and Shawnee hunters observe the cut trees and the grazing cattle. The farmers and the indigenous hunters exchange musket fire in the dense woods. The constant arrival of merchant ships at the Philadelphia docks pushes thousands of additional immigrants into the western valleys. The geographic space between the Susquehanna River and the Appalachian Mountains fills with cleared farmland and stone grist mills. By the 1740s, the Pennsylvania Land Office raises the price of paper land patents to £15 and 10 shillings for every 100 acres. The new immigrants calculate the high cost of the Pennsylvania land and look for cheaper alternatives. Ship captains and colonial surveyors circulate printed paper maps detailing vast, unoccupied river valleys located south of Pennsylvania. The farmers pack their iron axes, brass kettles, and leather-bound Bibles back into their wooden carts. They point their horses south, toward a long geological depression running parallel to the Blue Ridge Mountains. They steer their wooden wagon wheels onto a narrow dirt path originally created by indigenous hunting parties. The heavy iron rims of the wagon wheels crush the tall grass and pack the loose dirt into a solid track. The horses pull the wooden wagons southward, moving the population out of Pennsylvania and directly into the long expanse of the Shenandoah Valley. In the 1740s, Scottish Presbyterian families living in the Cumberland Valley of Pennsylvania begin packing their physical belongings into heavy wooden vehicles called Conestoga wagons. Carpenters in the Conestoga River region build the wagon beds using dense white oak and poplar boards. They construct the floorboards to curve upward at both the front and the rear. This curved design forces the loaded cargo to settle into the center and prevents the wooden crates from shifting on steep inclines. Blacksmiths heat iron bars in coal forges and hammer them into circular rims measuring 4 inches wide. They burn the hot iron rims directly onto the large wooden wheels. As the iron cools, it shrinks and binds the wooden spokes tightly together, protecting the wheels from splintering on the rocky ground. The families load heavy brass cooking kettles, iron broadaxes, and 50-pound sacks of seed corn into the deep wooden beds. They stretch a thick canvas cover over arched wooden hoops to block the rain and the direct sunlight. Farmers harness teams of 4 to 6 draft horses to the wooden hitching poles of each wagon, using thick leather straps and iron buckles. The drivers walk beside the draft animals and crack long leather whips in the air to drive the horses southward out of Pennsylvania. The wagons follow a narrow dirt trail originally forged by Iroquois and Algonquin hunting parties. The indigenous people call this route the Great Warrior's Path. The heavy iron rims of the Conestoga wagons crush the wild grass and pack the loose dirt into a wide, hard surface. The continuous traffic of thousands of heavy wagons and grazing cattle widens the trail into a thoroughfare known as the Great Wagon Road. The road leads the travelers through the town of Gettysburg and south toward the Maryland border. The families guide their horses toward the banks of the Potomac River at a shallow crossing point called Watkins Ferry. The river water measures waist-deep in the late summer months. The horses pull the heavy wooden wagons directly through the fast-flowing current. The cold water splashes against the wooden spokes and washes the dried mud from the iron wheel rims. The wagons climb the southern banks of the river and enter the Shenandoah Valley in the province of Virginia. The valley stretches for 200 miles between the Blue Ridge Mountains on the eastern side and the Allegheny Mountains on the western side. The travelers walk beside the moving wagons on the dirt road. The dirt road passes through the small settlement of Winchester, where the travelers purchase salt and lead musket balls from local merchants using silver coins. The colonial governor of Virginia signs paper land patents, granting vast tracts of valley acreage to land speculators. These speculators sell smaller parcels of land, measuring 100 to 400 acres, to the arriving Ulster Scots immigrants. The families halt their wagons near fast-flowing mountain streams like the Calf Pasture River and Linville Creek. The men unload their iron tools and immediately begin cutting the local timber to clear the ground for planting. Hundreds of other wagons bypass the Virginia settlements and continue rolling further south along the dirt road. The route stretches over 700 miles in total length. The horses pull the wagons up steep, rocky grades to cross the James River and the Roanoke River. The travelers pass through the high mountain gaps and enter the Piedmont region of the province of North Carolina. They drive their wagons across the shallow, rocky fords of the Yadkin River and the Catawba River. The soil in the Carolina backcountry consists of dense red clay. The farmers stop their wagons and use heavy iron hoes to break the hard clay crust. They plant yellow corn, green beans, and squash in the overturned soil. The women fetch water from the nearby creeks using wooden buckets bound with iron hoops. They build open fires using dried hickory branches and boil the water in their brass kettles to cook ground cornmeal into thick porridge. Throughout the 1750s and 1760s, tens of thousands of immigrants travel down this established dirt route. The wagons form continuous lines, and the heavy horse hooves kick up clouds of brown dust into the air. The families establish permanent farming communities deep inside the Appalachian mountain range. They locate their farms in the isolated hollows and the narrow river valleys bounded by steep granite ridges. The physical geography of these mountain valleys isolates the settlers from the eastern coastal ports and the established brick markets of the lowland cities. The families rely entirely on the raw materials found in the surrounding hardwood forests to construct their permanent shelters. Men walk into the dense stands of oak and hickory trees, carrying heavy iron broadaxes to fell the timber for their new homes. In 1638, Swedish and Finnish immigrants established a colony in the Delaware River Valley. These colonists built the first residential structures in North America using interlocking horizontal logs. The arriving Ulster Scots observe these timber buildings in the Pennsylvania settlements. The Scottish immigrants adopt this horizontal log construction to build their homes on the Appalachian frontier. Men walk into the dense mountain forests carrying heavy steel crosscut saws and forged iron felling axes. They target straight-trunked hardwood trees, specifically white oak, chestnut, and yellow poplar. Two men pull the crosscut saw back and forth to sever the tree trunks near the root base. They harness teams of draft horses wearing thick leather straps to drag the heavy logs out of the forest and into the cleared dirt fields. The builders use a specialized tool called a broadaxe to shape the round logs. The broadaxe features a heavy steel blade, flat on one side and beveled on the other. A man stands beside the felled log and swings the broadaxe vertically to slice away the curved outer bark. The iron blade cuts through the wood fibers, creating flat, square timber beams. They cut the square logs into specific lengths, measuring 16 or 20 feet. At the ends of each log, carpenters use iron hand saws and wooden mallets to cut angled interlocking joints. They utilize a specific angled cut called a half-dovetail notch. This specific notch forces the weight of the logs to slide inward. The inward pressure locks the corners of the structure tightly together. The men stack the horizontally prepared logs one on top of the other to form 4 solid walls, standing 8 to 10 feet high. Gaps remain between the stacked horizontal logs. Women and children collect red clay from the riverbanks and pull dry moss from the tree trunks. They mix the wet clay with the dry moss, loose dirt, and coarse horsehair. They press this thick mixture, called chinking, directly into the gaps between the timber beams. The chinking dries in the sun and solidifies into a hard seal. The hardened clay blocks the cold mountain wind and rain from entering the living space. For the roof, men cut short sections of oak logs. They place a heavy iron blade, called a froe, against the end of the log and strike it with a heavy wooden club. The iron blade splits the wood along the grain to produce thin, flat wooden shingles called shakes. They lay these wooden shakes in overlapping rows across the pitched roof frame. They place heavy river stones on top of long wooden poles to hold the wooden shakes down against the high mountain winds. They cut rectangular openings in the timber walls using iron handsaws to create windows. They stretch thick paper soaked in melted bear grease across the window frames to allow sunlight to enter the cabin while blocking the weather. For the floor, they split heavy logs in half and lay them flat side up, creating a solid wooden surface called a puncheon floor. Masons gather flat fieldstones and smooth granite river rocks to build a large chimney on one end of the cabin. They stack the stones using a thick mortar made from crushed limestone and river mud. The base of the chimney opens into a wide interior hearth measuring 5 feet across. Women build fires inside the hearth using dried hickory logs. They suspend heavy iron cooking pots directly over the open flames using forged iron hooks attached to a swinging metal crane. They boil ground cornmeal, wild turkey meat, and salted pork in the boiling water. The farmers use iron mattocks to pry heavy granite rocks out of the red clay soil. They stack these cleared rocks along the property lines to build dry stone walls. These low stone walls enclose the cultivated fields and prevent the grazing cattle from eating the growing corn stalks. The families construct small stone buildings called springhouses directly over cold, flowing mountain streams. The cold water lowers the ambient temperature inside the stone structure. The families store ceramic jugs of milk and wooden churns, filled with fresh butter, inside the springhouses to prevent the dairy products from spoiling. They build small wooden smokehouses to preserve their meat. They hang cuts of pork from the ceiling beams using hemp ropes. They keep a small hickory wood fire smoldering on the dirt floor for several days. The dense smoke coats the exterior of the meat and draws out the internal moisture, curing the pork for storage through the freezing winter months. The isolated geography forces the settlers to manufacture their own interior furnishings and daily supplies. Men use iron draw knives to peel the bark from hickory branches to construct 3-legged stools and simple bed frames. They weave tight sleeping surfaces using lengths of hemp rope pulled across the wooden bed frames. Women construct V-shaped wooden troughs called ash hoppers outside the cabins. They fill the hoppers with cold white ash collected from the hearth fires. They pour buckets of rainwater over the ash. The water filters through the ash and extracts potassium hydroxide, dripping out the bottom as a brown liquid called lye. The women boil this liquid lye in brass kettles mixed with rendered animal fat. The chemical reaction produces thick blocks of lye soap. The families raise flocks of sheep on the steep mountain slopes. They shear the raw wool using iron scissors and spin the fibers into yarn on foot-powered wooden spinning wheels. They weave the wool yarn and the linen thread together on large wooden handlooms. This combination of linen and wool creates a durable, warm cloth called linsey-woolsey. Women gather black walnut hulls from the forest floor and boil them in water to produce a dark brown dye. They submerge the woven cloth into the boiling dye to color the fabric. They also boil the roots of the madder plant to produce a red dye for their woolen blankets. Women sew this colored fabric into thick shirts and dresses using small steel needles and bone buttons. The self-contained economy of the mountain farms provides the families with food, clothing, and shelter. The farmers expand their land clearings further westward into the Ohio River watershed. Surveyors use brass compasses and iron measuring chains to mark new property lines deep in the western valleys. In 1754, French military officers stationed in the Ohio country distribute iron hatchets and lead musket balls to their indigenous allies, instructing them to target these new settlements. In the spring of 1754, French military engineers direct soldiers to cut white oak trees at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. They build Fort Duquesne using vertical wooden logs backed by packed earth measuring 10 feet thick. French officers bury stamped lead plates in the mud along the riverbanks to mark the territorial boundaries for King Louis XV. They open wooden crates filled with forged iron hatchets, steel knives, glass trade beads, and lead musket balls. They distribute these manufactured goods to warriors from the Shawnee, Lenape, and Mingo tribes. The French commanders instruct these allied indigenous fighters to push the English-speaking settlers out of the western river valleys. Indigenous war parties walk eastward through the dense Appalachian forests toward the isolated farmsteads of the province of Pennsylvania and the province of Virginia. The warriors attack the newly established Scots-Irish settlements along the Greenbrier River and the Holston River. They strike the timber-framed cabins using their iron hatchets to splinter the heavy wooden doors. They set fire to the split oak roof shingles using burning bundles of dried river reeds. The fires quickly consume the dry log cabins, the stored oat harvests, and the wooden spinning wheels. The raiding parties capture women and children, tying their wrists with stretched leather strips. They march the captives hundreds of miles back through the mountain passes to indigenous villages in the Ohio country. The fleeing Scots-Irish farmers walk eastward toward the stone churches of the larger colonial towns, abandoning their cleared agricultural fields. In the spring of 1755, British General Edward Braddock arrives in Virginia to launch a massive military expedition against Fort Duquesne. He commands a force of 2,100 regular British soldiers wearing bright red wool coats with polished brass buttons. The army marches westward through the dense forests, cutting a 12-foot-wide dirt road to transport heavy bronze artillery cannons and hundreds of wooden supply wagons. The British soldiers march in tight columns, aligning their shoulders and stepping in synchronization. They use iron axes to clear the brush and chop down trees, generating loud, rhythmic noises that echo through the narrow valleys. The indigenous scouts observe the slow-moving red columns from the cover of the elevated granite ridges. On July 9, 1755, the British Army crosses the shallow waters of the Monongahela River. 900 French and indigenous fighters position themselves behind thick oak tree trunks and heavy fallen logs on a wooded ravine. They fire lead musket balls directly into the advancing British columns. The British soldiers form rigid lines and fire synchronized volleys of lead balls into the dense forest canopy, stripping the green leaves from the high branches. The indigenous fighters remain concealed in the brush, firing continuously at the highly visible red coats. The lead projectiles strike General Braddock in the chest, knocking him off his horse. The British Army breaks formation and retreats eastward along the newly cut dirt road, leaving their heavy bronze cannons, wooden supply wagons, and dead draft horses in the forest. The retreating British regular army leaves the western frontier exposed to continuous raids. The Scots-Irish settlers organize local defense militias within their own communities. The men gather in the river valleys and construct large defensive buildings called blockhouses. They build these two-story structures using squared oak logs locked together with dovetail notches. They design the second floor to extend 2 feet over the edges of the first floor on all 4 sides. They cut small rectangular holes in the overhanging wooden floorboards. During an attack, the defenders stand on the second floor and fire lead musket balls straight down at attackers attempting to set fire to the wooden doors below. They surround these blockhouses with palisade walls made from 12-foot wooden logs driven vertically deep into the earth. Inside the wooden walls, they dig deep wells to secure drinking water during prolonged sieges. The Scots-Irish frontiersmen fight using a specialized weapon known as the Pennsylvania long rifle, later called the Kentucky rifle. German gunsmiths in Lancaster County forge the heavy iron barrels measuring 40 to 48 inches in length. The gunsmiths use specialized steel cutting tools to carve spiral grooves directly into the inside of the iron barrel. To load the weapon, the frontiersman pours a measured charge of black powder down the muzzle from a hollowed-out cow horn. He wraps a small piece of greased linen or buckskin around a lead ball before pushing it down the barrel with a hickory ramrod. When the rifle fires, the internal grooves force the lead ball to spin rapidly. This gyroscopic spin stabilizes the projectile in flight, allowing the shooter to strike a human target accurately at a distance of up to 300 yards. The backcountry militias adopt the combat tactics of their indigenous enemies to survive in the dense woods. The militiamen wear long, loose-fitting hunting shirts made from linsey-woolsey fabric. They boil black walnut hulls and tree bark to dye these shirts a dark brown color, blending visually with the tree bark and the forest shadows. They walk silently through the underbrush, wearing soft leather moccasins sewn from deer hides. They spread out in loose formations, taking cover behind rocks and thick trees to reload their rifles. The constant warfare over 7 years forces the isolated farmers to rely entirely on their own local military structures. They observe the British Army marching away from the western settlements. In the 1760s, the Eastern colonial governments imposed new taxes on the frontier population, demanding silver coins to pay the financial debts incurred during the Long War. The backcountry farmers in the province of North Carolina read the printed tax notices and organize a localized resistance movement to challenge the authority of the Eastern lawmakers. In 1768, farmers in the Piedmont region of the province of North Carolina form an organization called the Regulator Movement. The provincial government in the coastal capital of New Bern passes laws requiring citizens to pay an annual poll tax. The lawmakers mandate payment exclusively in silver or gold coins. The Scots-Irish farmers living in the western counties of Orange, Rowan, and Anson operate on an agricultural exchange system. They trade bushels of wheat, wooden barrels of salted pork, and woven linen cloth to acquire iron tools and salt. The colonial sheriffs ride horses into the backcountry settlements to collect the poll tax. The farmers offer agricultural goods as payment, and the sheriffs respond by seizing their draft horses, cast-iron plows, and hornless cattle. The sheriffs transport these confiscated goods to the town squares and sell them at public auctions. Local colonial officials, including a man named Edmund Fanning, purchase the confiscated property at these auctions for a fraction of its market value. The farmers organize large public meetings in the dirt fields and draft paper petitions using iron gall ink. They send these documents to Governor William Tryon, demanding the removal of sheriffs and the acceptance of agricultural goods as tax payment. Governor Tryon orders the sheriffs to continue collecting silver coins. In September 1770, a group of 150 regulators walks into the town of Hillsborough. They carry wooden clubs and iron-tipped pitchforks. They enter the wooden courthouse during an active session. They pull Edmund Fanning out of the building by his wool coat and drag him across the cobblestone street. They strike him with their wooden clubs and break the glass windows of his timber-framed house. Governor Tryon signs a piece of legislation called the Johnston Riot Act. This law authorizes the colonial governor to deploy military force against the backcountry residents. In the spring of 1771, Governor Tryon raises an army of 1,000 provincial militiamen from the eastern coastal counties. He arms the militia with new flintlock muskets and 2 heavy brass cannons mounted on wooden-wheeled carriages. Tryon marches this army westward along the dirt roads toward the center of the regulator territory. On May 16, 1771, Governor Tryon camps his army along the banks of Great Alamance Creek. A force of 2,000 regulators gathers in the adjacent fields and dense woods. The regulators wear dark brown linsey-woolsey hunting shirts and carry their long Pennsylvania rifles. The regulator force consists entirely of individual infantrymen carrying personal firearms and following local community leaders. Tryon sends a mounted messenger to the regulator lines, demanding their immediate surrender. The regulators shout at the messenger and hold their positions. Governor Tryon orders his artillerymen to light the fuses on the 2 brass cannons. The cannons fire heavy, solid iron balls into the tree lines, splintering the oak trunks and sending sharp wood fragments into the crowds of farmers. The eastern militia forms rigid linear ranks and fires synchronized volleys of lead musket balls. The regulators take cover behind large granite rocks and thick trees. They fire their long rifles, striking several militiamen in their wool coats. The battle lasts for exactly 2 hours. The regulators exhaust their supply of black powder and lead balls. The continuous fire from the brass cannons forces the farmers to abandon their positions and retreat deep into the surrounding forests. Governor Tryon orders his troops to pursue the fleeing men on horseback. The militiamen capture 15 regulator leaders and secure them with heavy iron chains. Tryon marches the army and the prisoners back to the town of Hillsborough. The military court conducts formal trials and sentences the men to death for treason against the British Crown. On June 19, 1771, carpenters construct a large wooden gallows on a hill outside the town. Soldiers secure thick hemp ropes around the necks of 6 regulator leaders, including a man named James Pugh. They hang the 6 men from the wooden beam. Governor Tryon commands his soldiers to burn the timber-framed cabins and destroy the crop fields belonging to the known regulators. The destruction of the farms and the executions push thousands of Scots-Irish families to pack their Conestoga wagons once again. They drive their draft horses further west, crossing the steep granite peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains to escape the jurisdiction of the British colonial government. They walk down into the isolated river valleys of the Watauga and Nolichucky rivers in present-day Tennessee. They build new log cabins in this remote region, establishing a settlement of frontiersmen known as the Over-Mountain Men. British military officers observe these western settlements during the American Revolutionary War and dispatch loyalist armies toward the Appalachian Range in the fall of 1780. In September 1780, British Major Patrick Ferguson commands an army of 1,000 loyalist militia soldiers in the province of South Carolina. Ferguson writes a paper letter at his camp in the village of Gilberttown. He hands the folded paper to a captured colonial prisoner named Samuel Phillips and releases him. Ferguson instructs Phillips to walk westward over the Appalachian Mountains. The written message states that if the mountain settlers refuse to swear an oath to the British Crown, Ferguson will march his army over the mountains, hang their leaders, and burn their log cabins with fire. Phillips walks through the mountain passes and delivers the paper message directly to Isaac Shelby, a local militia colonel living in the Watauga River Valley. Shelby mounts his horse and rides 40 miles to the log cabin of John Sevier. The two men sit at a wooden table and plan a military strike against Ferguson. They dispatch riders on horseback across the river valleys to summon the local Scots-Irish militias. They designate a flat dirt clearing along the Watauga River called Sycamore Shoals as the staging area. On September 25, 1780, 1,000 armed frontiersmen arrive at Sycamore Shoals. The men bring their draft horses and carry long grooved hunting rifles. They wear dark brown linsey-woolsey hunting shirts and soft leather moccasins. They pack small canvas pouches with parched yellow corn mixed with maple sugar to sustain themselves on the march. They pour melted lead into iron molds to cast hundreds of spherical rifle balls. Reverend Samuel Doak stands on a flat granite rock beside the river and speaks to the gathered men. He reads from his leather-bound Bible and shouts a specific phrase, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." The militiamen, known as the Over-Mountain Men, leave Sycamore Shoals and march eastward toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. They walk and ride up the steep incline of Roan Mountain. The elevation reaches 5,500 feet. A heavy snowstorm drops wet snow onto the rocky pass, covering the men's leather boots. They walk through the deep snow and descend the eastern slope of the mountain range into the Piedmont region of North Carolina. They follow the broad river southward, tracking the movement of Major Ferguson's army. Ferguson receives intelligence regarding the approaching frontiersmen. He orders his loyalist army to march toward the British headquarters in Charlotte to merge with General Charles Cornwallis. On October 6, 1780, Ferguson stops his army at Kings Mountain in South Carolina. Kings Mountain consists of a rocky plateau measuring 600 yards in length and rising 60 feet above the surrounding plain. Thick stands of pine and hardwood trees cover the steep slopes of the hill. Ferguson commands his men to establish a camp on the flat, treeless summit. He stations guards along the perimeter of the plateau. On the afternoon of October 7th, 1780, 900 Over-Mountain men arrive at the base of Kings Mountain. A heavy rain falls through the dense forest canopy. The frontiersmen take off their heavy wool hunting shirts and wrap the fabric tightly around the iron firing locks of their rifles. This action prevents the falling rainwater from soaking the black powder stored in the external firing pans. They divide their force into 4 distinct columns. They walk silently through the wet underbrush and completely encircle the base of the mountain. The frontiersmen remove the wet shirts from their rifles, pour black powder into the iron barrels, and push the lead balls down with hickory ramrods. They step out from the tree line and begin climbing the steep, rocky slopes. The Loyalist guards on the summit spot the advancing men and fire their smoothbore muskets down the hill. The frontiersmen take cover behind thick oak trunks and large granite boulders. The frontiersmen raise their long rifles, pull the iron triggers, and fire lead balls upward at the exposed loyalists standing on the summit. Ferguson blows a high-pitched silver whistle to issue combat commands. He orders his loyalist soldiers to fix 17-inch triangular steel bayonets to the ends of their muskets. The loyalists charge down the hill, thrusting the steel blades at the frontiersmen. The frontiersmen run backward down the slope, reload their rifles behind the trees, and shoot the charging loyalists. The loyalists retreat back to the summit. The frontiersmen resume their climb, moving upward from all sides of the mountain simultaneously. Ferguson rides a white horse across the flat summit. He wears a checkered hunting shirt over his red wool uniform coat. He continuously blows the silver whistle to direct the troop movements. The frontiersmen reach the edge of the plateau and fire a synchronized volley from their rifles. 7 lead balls strike Ferguson in his chest and arms. He falls off the white horse and lands on the rocky ground. Ferguson dies directly on the summit. The loyalist soldiers observe the death of their commander. They drop their muskets and raise white flags woven from cotton cloth. The gunfire stops. The entire engagement lasts exactly 65 minutes. The frontiersmen capture 200 loyalists and bury the dead bodies in shallow dirt trenches on the plateau. Years later, Thomas Jefferson writes a letter using pen and ink, specifically citing the 65 minutes at Kings Mountain as the engagement that altered the trajectory of the American Revolutionary War. The over-mountain men load their horses with captured British muskets and walk back over the Blue Ridge Mountains to their isolated farms. They return to planting corn and rye in their cleared dirt fields. By the 1790s, the farmers harvest more grain than their horses can pull in wooden wagons to the eastern markets. They begin constructing large copper kettles and wooden vats in their barns to distill the surplus rye and corn into liquid whiskey. In the 1790s, farmers living in the Monongahela River Valley of western Pennsylvania harvest large crops of rye and yellow corn. They transport the grain in wooden carts to stone grist mills located along the fast-flowing creeks. The heavy circular grinding stones crush the kernels into coarse meal. The men pour the ground meal into 50-gallon wooden vats called mash tuns and mix it with water drawn from cold mountain springs. The mixture sits in the wooden vats for several days to ferment. The farmers transfer the fermented liquid into copper pot stills. They build hickory wood fires directly underneath the copper pots. The heat boils the liquid, causing alcohol vapor to rise into a coiled copper tube known as a worm. The vapor passes through the cold copper worm, condenses back into a liquid state, and drips into hollowed-out white oak barrels. The physical geography of the Allegheny Mountains limits the transportation of raw grain. A single packhorse carries a maximum of 4 bushels of raw rye grain over the steep, rocky mountain passes to the eastern markets. That same packhorse carries 2 wooden kegs of distilled whiskey, representing the concentrated value of 24 bushels of grain. The farmers use this distilled liquid as a physical currency in the cash-poor western counties. They trade wooden jugs of whiskey to local merchants in exchange for forged iron nails, 50-pound bags of salt, and lead musket balls. On March 3, 1791, the United States Congress passes a new tax law drafted by Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. The legislation places a federal excise tax on domestically distilled spirits. The law requires rural distillers to pay a tax of 9 cents per gallon in silver or copper coins. Eastern commercial distillers pay a flat annual fee, lowering their effective tax rate to 6 cents per gallon. The backcountry farmers lack the physical silver coins required to pay the tax. The federal government appoints local men to serve as tax collectors. On September 11, 1791, a tax collector named Robert Johnson rides a horse near Pigeon Creek in Washington County, Pennsylvania. A group of 11 men wearing black cloths over their faces intercepts Johnson on a dirt road. They pull him off his horse and strip away his wool coat and linen shirt. They heat a bucket of pine tar over a wood fire and pour the boiling black liquid over his bare torso. They empty a canvas sack of chicken feathers over the hot tar. The feathers stick to the cooling tar on his skin. The men take Johnson's horse and leave him walking in the forest. The physical attacks against tax collectors continue over the next 3 years. Men shoot lead musket balls through the copper stills of farmers who pay the tax, punching holes in the metal. In July 1794, United States Marshal David Lennox travels to western Pennsylvania to deliver written court summons to delinquent distillers. Regional Tax Inspector John Neville guides Lennox to the frontier farms. On July 16th, a group of armed farmers surrounds Neville's timber-framed house at Bower Hill. Neville fires a musket from a window, striking a farmer named Oliver Miller in the chest. The next day, 500 armed militiamen march to Bower Hill carrying long Pennsylvania rifles. Major James McFarland commands the rebel force. Neville flees the property, leaving a detachment of regular United States soldiers from Fort Fayette to defend the house. The soldiers fire lead musket balls from the windows. The farmers take cover behind oak trees and return fire. McFarland steps out from behind a tree, and a lead ball strikes him in the head, killing him immediately. The farmers set fire to the wooden slave quarters, the barn, and the main house. The wooden structures burn completely to the ground. News of the burned house reaches the federal government in Philadelphia. President George Washington issues a paper proclamation ordering the militias of 4 states to mobilize. On September 30th, 1794, Washington puts on his blue and buff military uniform and rides a horse westward to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He inspects a gathered force of 12,950 militiamen drawn from New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, and eastern Pennsylvania. General Henry Lee assumes direct command of the army. In October 1794, the militia army marches westward along the dirt roads. Draft horses pull heavy bronze cannons and wooden supply wagons over the steep ridges of the Allegheny Mountains. The soldiers descend into the western river valleys of Pennsylvania. The rebel farmers observe the massive military column and scatter into the dense hardwood forests. The federal troops arrest 150 men and lock them inside local stone jails. The soldiers march 20 of the accused leaders back over the mountains to Philadelphia. The federal courts convict 2 men of treason, and President Washington signs paper documents granting them full pardons. Federal collectors continue to gather silver coins from the western distillers. To avoid the tax, many Scots-Irish families pack their Conestoga wagons and leave western Pennsylvania. They drive their draft horses further south and west into the steep hollows of the Appalachian Mountains in Kentucky and Tennessee. They build new log cabins hidden deep in the narrow valleys. Inside these mountain cabins, the women sit beside the open stone hearths and sing vocal melodies to their children. They pass down rhythmic stories of the Scottish borderlands, while the men use iron pocket knives to carve musical instruments from local cherry and walnut wood. Inside the log cabins of the Appalachian Mountains, women sit beside the open stone hearths. They sing narrative songs known as ballads, passing the lyrics down through direct oral repetition. The women sing using a 5-note musical scale called the pentatonic scale. They sing utilizing exclusively the physical projection of their vocal cords. The singers project their voices directly from the nasal cavity, generating a loud, sharp tone known as the high lonesome sound. The ballads feature 4-line stanzas alternating between 8 syllables and 6 syllables per line. The mothers sing specific songs like Barbara Allen and the Two Sisters. These specific songs originate in the Anglo-Scottish border region during the 17th century. The singers memorize dozens of individual verses to recount the complete narrative of each song. The women spin raw flax fibers on wooden wheels while they sing. The spinning wheels produce a rhythmic wooden clicking sound, keeping precise time with the vocal melody. Men in the mountain settlements build wooden fiddles using local hardwood trees. They cut maple wood to carve the solid back of the instrument and use spruce wood for the flat front soundboard. They stretch 4 sheep gut strings across a carved wooden bridge. The musicians use a technique called cross-tuning, tightening the 4 strings to form an open chord. They hold a curved wooden bow strung with coarse horsehair. They rub solid pine rosin onto the horsehair to increase the friction. The musician pulls the bow across the strings, striking multiple strings simultaneously to create a continuous underlying drone note. The fiddle players perform fast-paced tunes in a 6/8 time signature called jigs and reels. Men and women gather in wooden barns with cleared plank floors to dance to this music. The dancers wear leather shoes with small iron plates nailed to the heels and toes. They strike their iron-clad heels against the wooden floorboards in synchronization with the fiddle bow. This percussive footwork derives directly from the step dancing of the Scottish lowlands and develops into the regional practice of Appalachian clogging. Local woodworkers construct a fretted stringed instrument called the mountain dulcimer. They adopt the basic design from a smaller wooden instrument called the scheitholt, brought to the Pennsylvania colonies by German immigrants. The Scots-Irish craftsmen alter the design by expanding the wooden sound box to increase the acoustic volume. They cut thin boards of local black walnut and cherry wood using iron hand planes. They steam the wooden boards over boiling water and bend them into a wide hourglass shape. They glue a raised wooden fretboard down the center of the hollow body and attach 3 or 4 steel strings. The musician places the wooden instrument flat across their lap. They press a small wooden dowel against the strings with their left hand to change the musical pitch. They pluck the steel strings with their right hand using a stiff turkey feather. Over successive generations, the mountain singers alter the specific words of the inherited border ballads. They replace the names of Scottish lords and stone castles with the names of local Appalachian ridges and river valleys. The singers compose new verses detailing specific physical events occurring in the surrounding region. They write lyrics describing the collapse of deep coal mine shafts and the derailment of iron steam locomotives. The coal miners use iron pickaxes to chip away the black bituminous coal from the subterranean seams. They sing songs detailing the accumulation of explosive methane gas inside the dark mine shafts. Men swing 9-pound steel hammers to drive steel drills into the mountain rock to clear railroad tunnels. They sing rhythmic work songs to coordinate the timing of the hammer strikes. They sing about a steel-driving man named John Henry working on the Big Bend Tunnel in West Virginia in 1870. They document local crimes in their songs, detailing the physical drowning of Naomi Wise in the Deep River of North Carolina in 1808. The combination of these adapted narrative lyrics and the fast-paced fiddle instrumentation forms the structural foundation of American bluegrass music. In July 1916, an English folklorist named Cecil Sharp travels into the Appalachian Mountains. He walks along the steep dirt trails of Madison County, North Carolina, accompanied by an American researcher named Olive Dame Campbell. The dirt trails feature steep inclines and muddy switchbacks. Sharp and Campbell walk on foot, carrying their paper notebooks inside waterproof canvas bags. Sharp targets the isolated Scots-Irish communities to document their preserved musical traditions. He knocks on the wooden doors of the timber-framed cabins and asks the residents to sing their family songs. The residents sit on their wooden porches and sing the unaccompanied vocal melodies. Sharp sits on a wooden stool and listens to the specific pitch intervals. He uses a graphite pencil to write the musical notes onto paper staves. Campbell writes the spoken English lyrics into her bound paper notebooks. Sharp spends 46 weeks walking through the mountain communities of North Carolina, Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee. He records the specific melodies and words of 1,612 distinct songs. He identifies these songs directly with the historical ballads printed on paper broadsides in London and Edinburgh during the 17th century. Sharp publishes these transcribed songs in a printed book in 1917. The paper transcription of these border ballads preserves the physical record of the oral tradition. The descendants of these frontier families pack their wooden wagons again and travel out of the mountain hollows. They enter the formal political buildings of the new American Republic. In 1829, a man born to immigrants from County Antrim stands on the stone steps of the United States Capitol to take the oath of office as the president. On March 4, 1829, Andrew Jackson stands on the east portico of the United States Capitol building in Washington, D.C. He wears a black wool suit and places his right hand on a leather-bound Bible to take the presidential oath of office. Chief Justice John Marshall administers the spoken oath. Jackson is the 7th president of the USA and the first president born to immigrant parents of direct Scots-Irish descent. In 1765, his father, Andrew Jackson Sr., and his mother, Elizabeth Hutchinson, packed their iron cooking tools and left the village of Boney Before in County Antrim. They boarded a wooden merchant vessel in the port of Larne and sailed across the Atlantic Ocean. They traveled south along the Great Wagon Road and claimed a plot of red clay soil in the Waxhaws region on the border of North Carolina and South Carolina. Andrew Jackson was born on this frontier farm 2 years later, in 1767. 16 years after Jackson takes the oath, James Knox Polk stands on the same stone steps on March 4, 1845. Polk traces his direct paternal ancestry to a Scottish family named Pollock. The Pollock family left the town of Coleraine in County Londonderry and sailed to the colony of Maryland in 1680. During his presidency, Polk signs paper treaties with British diplomats and orders military infantry units to march south to the Rio Grande, expanding the western borders of the USA directly to the Pacific Ocean coast. On March 4, 1857, James Buchanan takes the oath as the 15th president. Buchanan's father, James Buchanan Sr., was born in the town of Ramelton, in County Donegal. The father immigrated to the port of Philadelphia in 1783 and purchased a tract of land in the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania. The son grows up in a log cabin built from square-hewn timber and eats food cooked over an open stone hearth. Following the American Civil War, Andrew Johnson takes the oath of office inside a brick boarding house in Washington, D.C. Johnson's grandfather emigrated from the town of Mount Hill in County Antrim in 1750 and acquired land in the American colonies. Ulysses S. Grant wins the presidential election of 1868. Grant's great-grandfather, John Simpson, was born in the town of Durgina in County Tyrone. Simpson packed his belongings in 1738 and traveled across the ocean to find agricultural work in Pennsylvania. Chester A. Arthur takes the oath of office in September 1881 inside a brownstone house in New York City. Arthur's father, William Arthur, was born in the village of Dreen in County Antrim. William Arthur read paper books at Belfast College before crossing the Atlantic to work as a Baptist minister. Grover Cleveland serves 2 terms starting in 1885. Cleveland's maternal grandfather, Abner Neal, immigrated from County Antrim to America in the late 18th century, carrying his physical belongings in wooden crates. William McKinley takes the oath in 1897. His great-great-grandfather, James McKinley, left the town of Conager in County Antrim in 1743. On March 4, 1913, Woodrow Wilson takes the oath of office. Wilson's grandfather, James Wilson, lived in a stone house in the town of Strabane in County Tyrone. James Wilson worked as a printer, pressing metal type onto paper sheets, before leaving Ulster in 1807 to find work in Philadelphia. Woodrow Wilson physically travels across the Atlantic Ocean during his presidency and visits the exact stone house of his grandfather in County Tyrone. The descendants of the Ulster planters continue to hold executive office in the mid-20th century. Harry S. Truman, the 33rd president, traces his maternal ancestry to a family named Holmes from County Londonderry. Richard Nixon takes the oath of office on January 20, 1969. Nixon's maternal ancestors, the Millhouse family, were practicing Quakers who left County Antrim in 1729 to cultivate soil in the Pennsylvania colony. In total, at least 17 men who serve as President of the USA carry the specific genetic ancestry of the Lowland Scots and the Ulster plantations. These families complete a distinct physical migration across 3 separate geographic frontiers over a period of 3 centuries. They rode small horses across the wet peat bogs of the Cheviot Hills on the Anglo-Scottish border in the 1600s. They swung heavy iron hammers to construct defensive stone bournes and planted oat seeds in the damp soil of the northern Irish counties in the 1640s. They sailed in the dark wooden steerage decks of merchant ships across the Atlantic Ocean in the 1720s. They swung forged iron broadaxes to cut dense white oak trees and built horizontal log cabins deep in the Appalachian Mountains in the 1770s. The descendants of these border farmers, weavers and frontier fighters secure political positions inside the marble and sandstone government buildings of the national capital.